Welcome, everyone. As some of the audience members are still arriving, I'm the warm-up act before we move to today's guest speaker, Professor Patrick Gloner. My name is David Wood, and in addition to giving occasional warm-up remarks, I chair London Futurists. Our subject today is the best way to govern the increasingly wide use of systems that use increasingly powerful AI. Such systems have increasingly large potential upsides and increasingly large potential downsides. For example, consider the Boeing 737 MAX airplane, which included an innovative AI-based software system called Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS. The MCAS was tested, apparently, for many years and was certified by the US Federal Aviation Administration in March 2017 as being fit for purpose. What happened next? In October 2018 and in March 2019, 2 plane crashes happened as a result of an error within that system. In some circumstances, pretty rare circumstances, MCAS could give a fatal nose-down command to the plane without the human pilots being able to override it. 346 people died in these 2 crashes. Subsequent investigations showed that Boeing, in part, had been aware of potential problems with this system and had covered them up. Boeing and the Federal Aviation Authority had colluded on some recertification test flights. Boeing had also retaliated against internal whistleblowers. In the end, with a court case pending, Boeing paid $2.5 billion in penalties and compensation. But things could be much worse in the future. Other AI systems could be placed in charge not just of airplanes, but of larger parts of society's critical infrastructure. Like the Boeing MCAS, these systems might work well for a number of years before a bug manifests in a rare circumstance, with an impact not on hundreds of lives, but potentially on millions or even billions of lives. However, the same sort of AI systems, if they work well, could enable significantly better education, more comprehensive healthcare, more affordable housing, widespread cleaner energy, lower cost production of nutritious food, among many other consumer goods and services, and yes, safer transport. So how do we strike the best balance between protecting against possible catastrophic harms while still encouraging profound innovative benefits for humanity? And as well as considering harms and benefits at the social and civilizational levels, similar questions arise concerning harms and benefits at the individual level. And these harms and benefits could, in both cases, have serious life-changing consequences. In this context, lawmakers within the EU have proposed an EU AI Act. It's an ambitious piece of legislation. However, as we'll hear today, various observers have expressed serious concern about parts of this legislation. And that leads me to introduce our speaker. Patrick Gloner has been a full professor of artificial intelligence at Deggendorf Institute of Technology in Germany since the age of 30. He is also the Ramon O'Callaghan Professor of Technology Management and Innovation at Waksen University in Hyderabad, India. In parallel to his academic roles, Patrick is the founder and CEO of Skyrocket.ai, an AI consulting firm. As an expert witness, Patrick has advised the parliaments of France, Germany, and Luxembourg, and he also regularly advises politicians at the European, federal, state, and local levels. He has published 5 books, and his writings on AI have been featured in numerous publications worldwide. Patrick, many thanks for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show today. So the AI Act is something that was proposed nearly 2 years ago by the European Commission. Before that, the European Commission had already published an AI white paper, maybe some 3 or 4 years ago. If you read the AI white paper, you mainly see concerns and worries, not too many opportunities. If you look at the white paper, the term China is not mentioned a single time. And now when you look at China, China is key to AI innovation, and the EU Commission somehow had not understood that when they wrote their AI sort of strategy document, the white paper. Then 2 years ago, they published a draft of the AI Act, which is again a very negative document, a document driven by fears, by that fear of an out of control AI that would sort of end our lives, but not driven by opportunity. And if you look at the AI Act, first of all, one question is, what is an AI? So you need to define what an AI is before you start actually regulating it. The first proposal of the AI Act covered machine learning, so neural networks, expert systems, and I would say, yes, that's an AI, but the definition was much broader. It also included other things like every possible optimization method, every possible statistical method. So once you calculate the mean of 2 numbers, you're applying a statistical method. So now just using a calculator is regulated, because an AI would be considered not just like the high-end AIs we know, but also a calculator could suddenly be an AI. So it's an extremely broad definition that covers not just the AI we actually deal with, but every possible piece of software. Then the AI Act addresses different risk levels. The most critical ones are the high-risk domain and the domain of forbidden AI applications. The AI Act, however, is a horizontal piece of regulation, so it addresses every possible domain, every possible use case, and not just a certain sector or industry as you would address in a vertical regulation. So it's horizontal, which makes it quite complex. And what is high risk? So when I think about high risk, I first of all think about something that can pose a threat to health and safety. However, initially the AI Act had a very, very broad definition for high risk, which stated something like if you could get any kind of damage from it, be it physical, psychological, financially, whatever. So even a Google search would then be high risk because you could just turn crazy from the result, or you could get sick, whatever. ChatGPT would also then be high risk, by the way. Now, parliaments have done expert hearings. There have been all sorts of amendments tabled, both by the European Parliament as well as the presidents or presidencies of the European Council. Now the high risk has been slightly redefined. However, it's still extremely broad and extremely vague. And that is one of the overall problems of the AI Act. It uses very non-specific language. The document is more than 100 pages written by lawyers, and just no one knows what it's actually about and what all of these terms and sentences mean. For the high-risk domain, there are also a number of very strict requirements, including that the data set used would need to be, you would need to have a perfect data set, a data set that is error-free, unbiased, and complete. If you want a complete data set, that would actually be usually violating GDPR. So it's also contradictory to existing regulation. And usually there's not really any data set that is error-free or bias-free. You always have some error or some bias in a real-world data set. But if you're required to have a perfect training set, then suddenly building a lot of these applications would not be possible anymore. So that's a big problem. So a lot of the requirements are just unfeasible. You will not be able to build these kind of systems anymore, and there will be consequences. So companies may be moving their AI R&D outside the European Union, maybe to the UK, which would then eventually benefit from Brexit, or to China, Singapore, or the US, or wherever. Again, that would mean for Europe that we lose opportunities, as we have done so often in recent decades. And eventually these systems will be built elsewhere, but we will have no control over them because we're forced to import them, and we won't be able to contribute to R&D. And I think that's a big mistake. When I saw the first draft of the AI Act, which was nearly 2 years ago, we very early had a hearing in the European Affairs committees of the German Parliament and the French Parliament. So the two committees had a joint session in May 2021, and I was one of the expert witnesses. And I discussed the AI definition, and I said, yeah, it's extremely broad in one sense that it covers also statistical methods, optimization methods. But on the other hand, it's also very narrow because it only covered software doing that. And I said, well, you can just build a piece of hardware that does that, for which you don't need software. So you're just hardwiring logic, and then you have an AI built in a piece of hardware without software, and that would not be regulated eventually. After the hearing, one of the drafters of the AI Act contacted me, and they wondered how you could build a computer system without software, how you could build a purely hardware-based computer system. And they just didn't know what that was. And I said, hey, that's computer science 101. You know, in your first year of computer science, you're starting with building or designing hardware. Operating systems and all of this, which you need to run software, comes later. So I felt that those people who drafted the AI Act really had no clue about AI or computer science in general. And this is one of the key problems of the AI Act. Overall, the AI Act will be a big mistake. A number of amendments have been tabled. Actually, quite a few thousand amendments have been tabled in the EU Parliament. Then the presidencies of the European Council have done a lot of amendments. But the actual big question, whether we need the AI Act at all, has never been addressed. And I don't think we actually need the AI Act. What we need is strong vertical regulation that actually addresses systems in critical domains that do something. And for that, we already got a lot of existing vertical regulations. So if you want to build an airplane, a car, a nuclear power plant, whatever, there is regulation. But that regulation addresses systems that do something and not really that much of how it's being implemented. And in an overall large system, an AI will always be just a minor part. And that's why I don't think we need AI regulation on top. And where there are new use cases that could have never been imagined before, well, then come up with vertical regulation addressing such use cases and such systems, but not actually the AI, because the AI is just a tool to implement it. And if you find a different tool in the future to implement that use case, then it wouldn't be regulated as well. So do more vertical regulation where it's really necessary. But I think most of those very critical use cases that pose a threat to health and safety are regulated already. So this is my first 10 minutes talking about the AI Act and telling you what I think about it. And now I look forward to David's questions and your questions.
Well, thanks very much for getting us going there. So what's been the reaction when you have suggested we don't need such a big act? We need something that's targeted to individual cases. Have the politicians said, hey, you're right, we don't need all this effort. Let's break it down piecemeal.
I have talked to many lawmakers in the European Parliament, including some of the leadership of the individual groups. Once I explained them why the AI Act just doesn't work, at some point they actually agreed and said, yeah, no one had explained it that way to them before. And I also discussed a lot of the benefits that actually come from AI. And then they agreed sort of that my explanation made sense. And then I told them, well, then you can actually just cancel the AI Act. And they said, we're unable to do this because we want to appreciate the work by the members of our group. We don't just want to cancel it and sort of render their work void. So they're sort of aware that they are going into the wrong direction, but they are unable or unwilling to stop.
But people may say there are general things that AI can get wrong, and it's across multiple different industries. For example, AI is sometimes opaque, and people may be the victim of algorithms which they ought to be able to query and question. So if they get turned down for a mortgage application, or their bail is refused if they're up for a criminal case and it's based on an AI, the argument is that across all these fields, people should be able to know, first of all, that an AI was involved in that decision. And they, according to, I think, some of the ideas in the Act, is that people should be able, in a serious case, to query what was the cause here, what was the AI thinking, rather than just computer says no, to quote a famous saying from a British TV.
Well, partially that right exists already. For example, if you look at the GDPR, there's a right to knowing those things, or at least that has been argued. But you've now mentioned the term algorithm. And something I've also noticed when I talk to lawmakers, they actually sort of confuse algorithms with AI. They think like every algorithm is an AI or something like this. But actually, most algorithms are not an AI, but some are an AI. But I felt a lot of lawmakers don't really get that difference. But for algorithm decision making, you already have a right for a review or explanation, which comes from the GDPR. So, if that right did not exist, maybe created for algorithms in general, but I don't see why we should then just look into AI algorithms, while most algorithms are not related to AI at all.
So just to dig into this a bit, I guess the difference is an algorithm is a straightforward, unchanging formula. You might put the numbers into a spreadsheet and it will say yes or no. Whereas an AI will learn from data and it will get its feedback. It will develop its weights, so-called, its biases, so-called. Well, bias is a technical term too, how much attention to pay to various factors. It will find that out as a process of learning and being given feedback by training as to whether its decisions matched up. So the argument is that the training systems potentially introduce extra real-world bias if the data is misleading, if the data has just been tested on men, for example, or just on white men, and then it's applied more generally to people of multiple genders and multiple races, then this is a bad thing. And I think, isn't that what some of the ideas behind the AI Act is?
Well, if you look at the definition of an algorithm is like a sequence of command or well-defined sequence of commands. So there are different definitions of what an algorithm is. And an AI is eventually also implemented through an algorithm. And if you look at different class of algorithms, there are deterministic algorithms, there are probabilistic algorithms. Some AI algorithms are deterministic, some are probabilistic. And the AI algorithms, usually they would load some data for the weights, but still it's an algorithm. Nonetheless, yes, discrimination may be introduced through AI, and that obviously needs to be prevented. But that's why, again, look at vertical regulation, look at penalty codes. Discrimination is forbidden to a large extent. So I don't see why we should ban it on top, specifically to AI. We can simply use the existing vertical regulation or penalty code or whatever, the GDPR. And in my point of view, that's just enough.
One of the questions asks about your views on the GDPR, because that's something we've had for a number of years now. What's your assessment of that? And what is the EU assessment of it? Are they saying, hey, that was a success, let's do more of it? Or are they saying, that didn't quite work, let's be wiser in what we're doing in the future?
Well, the GDPR is one of those disasters. I think it once had a very good intention that people should have control over their data. But finally, I think it turned out to be a complete disaster when it comes to innovation, because a lot of innovation is leaving Europe, going elsewhere because of GDPR. And again, GDPR came up with so many rules, with so many requirements that are unfeasible and just creating an enormous burden for companies. One of the initial ideas of GDPR was also to sort of weaken the large cloud providers from the US, and an idea was to strengthen SMEs in Europe. But then if you come up with all of these rules, and they tend to be infeasible to implement, what happened was actually those large cloud providers from the US, they were even strengthened because of this, and SMEs got hurt because SMEs don't have the means to implement all of those rules. They don't have the means to pay for lawsuits or for thousands of lawyers who would just, wait it out. So what we see is actually these large cloud providers, they became even stronger because of GDPR, and I don't really think that that was one of the intentions. And certainly the same would be caused by the AI Act. SMEs in Europe would get severely hurt, and large cloud providers from outside Europe would eventually become the winners.
That question, by the way, was by Paul Imre. Just to follow this up, you said that as a result of GDPR, innovation has moved elsewhere from Europe. Is there data to back that up?
Well, I see this when I talk to my customers. I'm not aware of any major studies about this. There were articles like this in business magazines, but I'm not aware if there is research on that. I would also need to look that up.
Because people often say, well, if you raise the corporation tax too high, you're going to have companies leaving and going abroad. But the evidence is by no means clear on this. People may say if it's too expensive, they might look elsewhere, but there are other reasons to stay around. But maybe what's happening is that companies aren't so much moving away as they're just stopping working in this field and they're working on other things instead, or even just going out of business.
Well, I have one example. In my university a few years ago, one of my colleagues created an AI that was integrated into our internal e-learning portal, where students upload their coursework during the term, and during after half of the term, you would sort of get a prediction if you are likely to pass the final exam or if you're likely to fail based on your performance in the coursework during the first half of the term. So what they used was the performance of previous years in the coursework as well as the final exam. And then they build an AI that learns that correlation. And I think that's a very positive kind of system. So students sort of get an early assessment of how they are doing and whether they should work harder or not. And because of GDPR, we had to shut down that system. So students now get less support because of GDPR. And also, obviously, GDPR not only made things impossible, but also costs went up because you need all of these external auditors for your GDPR. And they are actually earning a fortune. So if you look at Deloitte, EY, and so forth, they are definitely very happy about GDPR because it comes with all sorts of auditing and certifications. But it definitely, I see it also with my clients, it has made business more difficult. They have stopped certain services like we have in my university, and that's certainly not a positive thing.
And is there any move to change the regulation there? The people have said, well, we didn't realize or we didn't fully anticipate the damage to important data flows. Therefore, let's tweak the systems, because nobody expects to get legislation completely right first time.
Yeah, when I talk to members of the European Parliament, my understanding is that a lot of them have understood that the GDPR has not really worked out and that it certainly has been a big failure. But they still, I think they want to observe for a longer time and then maybe correct at some point. but I don't see this happening anytime soon. And the GDPR is just one of many of those examples. So there's also the medical device regulation that was also ratified a few years ago. And now more and more SMEs are shutting down and they are unable to provide highly specialized medical equipment that is very unique because of the high cost for certification. So it's not just, that this leads to economic consequences, that people lose their job or companies make less profit and pay less tax. It also means that people don't get the kind of treatment they are actually able to get and that they got in the past, that they sometimes got for decades, and now companies are out of business because of the medical device regulation. And if you look back 10 years ago, obviously product safety in Europe in the medical domain was already extremely good. And then we tried adding even more regulation, and now people don't get the treatment anymore they got 10 years ago.
I saw something like this in my own professional life when I was with Accenture for a few years. And one of the initiatives I helped to drive was mobile health solutions. And part of that was involved with possible new medical devices. And Accenture as a whole said, gosh, this is quite legislatively difficult, even a large company. They said, we could do it, but frankly, there are easier ways to make money. There are big mainframe systems, or not mainframe systems, but cloud-based computing systems, which we can sell to health providers. And so the view was, let's not do this because, there are easier things, and goodness knows how much work there is with these regulations and if there are legal cases. So if even a large company like Accenture had that worries, I'm sure things have changed, by the way, in the many years I've been there, so don't take this as an account of what's happening now, but I can sympathize with what smaller companies will have to face if there is unintentional heavyweight issues in facing them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these problems come just from overly lengthy texts that are extremely unclear and extremely ambiguous. And that's the case for GDPR, the medical device regulation, the AI Act. A lot of the language is extremely non-specific. You just don't know what it means. It's hundreds of pages. It's not very precise. And that actually also creates a lot of confusion when it comes to enforcement, because you just are unsure what actually all of this regulation is about. And especially with the GDPR, which sort of gets enforced at a national level, there are countries that are more pro-innovation, in which the courts and the government authorities don't enforce it that strictly, while we in Germany, again, we try to overdo it. And in Germany, it's particularly difficult because we have on the federal level a data protection agency run by the federal government, but we also have one on state level, and we have 16 states. And so we have 17 data protection agencies, and they all disagree even about very simple fundamental questions. And all of this is caused by overly lengthy documents that come with extremely non-specific language.
If the EU isn't doing this well, where in the world are people perhaps doing it better?
Well, I think if you look at the US, it's definitely pro-innovation, or also China, where I see that, first of all, you try out things, and once there are problems, you try to correct. And I think that's the right approach. Obviously, if you do different things, like you build a nuclear power plant, obviously safety first, that's for sure. But first of all, you need to support innovation in the digital domain. And if you are driven by fears and you try to stifle innovation early on, certainly your competitors will benefit. And I think China and the US are doing much better in that kind of approach.
But isn't there the risk that some AI systems will unintentionally have the same kind of catastrophic consequences as a badly engineered nuclear power plant? That because these systems aren't well understood, they're black box, they have unintended combinational effects, then it may be that somebody like Mark Zuckerberg says, hey, let's move fast and break things, and when we break things, we will learn and we'll be smarter. But the consequence of something disastrous being broken is not something that can easily be rolled back. I spoke at the beginning about airplanes crashing with hundreds of people killed. That was bad, but things might be much worse if these systems are deployed. I think that's part of the thinking that's going on here.
Well, you mentioned the Boeing example, and you mentioned that they were actually aware of the failure, and yet they did not correct, and the government authorities did not correct either. But there was actually an earlier reason why they needed to build that AI system. The issue was, I think they tried to use an old model of engines or something, and their plane heavily leaned to the front or back or something like this. So, and they needed a system to automatically correct this. So in fact, they had a major engineering issue with that plane. And that was the cause of all of that. And they weren't able or weren't willing to fix it. And then they came up with this system to fix it. And they were aware of that it didn't work. And the government as well was aware of that issue. And I think a lot of stuff went wrong. And so even if you come up with a lot of new regulation, this can happen as well. Again, and I think there should be more serious consequences for the Boeing thing, not just that they pay 2.5 billion or whatever, but I think the government should lock up the responsible people who knew what they were doing, and there must be very harsh consequences in order to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Let's take a question from Terry Raby, who makes a comparison with GM. And this might be a bit controversial. GM, genetically modified foods. And his view, which I share, is that some of the EU regulations or dislike to GM is badly motivated scientifically. There is no good scientific reasons to be so afraid of genetic modifications. And as a result, maybe there are lack of innovations, lack of good nutrition available in at least some EU countries. Now, Terry says that the GM was destroyed not just by incompetence, but by deliberate campaigning by groups such as Greenpeace. So it's not just a incompetence, it was sort of actively organized. Are there similar forces behind the bad aspects of the AI Act, or is it simply that politicians are out of their depths?
It's absolutely the same here. So here in Germany, if you look at labor unions and other organizations, they're actively pushing for the AI Act, and they come up with all sorts of nonsense fears that are just unrealistic. And in fact, like labor unions, they should be like, they think an AI would put their workers out of business, but it's not really about an AI making people unemployed. The AI allows us to become more competitive, and we can make sure that those companies that employ these people will actually still exist in the foreseeable future. So we should be open to change, open to innovation in order to remain competitive. And I've also talked to labor unions a number of times now, and they also want more regulation for AI used in manufacturing, because they are sort of worried that an AI could hurt their workers there. But hey, all of that is regulated already. So you need to have a distance between the workers and the machines. You need all sorts of safety fences, whatever. And then if an AI runs in those systems or not, it just doesn't matter. You cannot get any physical harm on top because of the AI, because where there is a risk for physical harm, that is regulated already. Yeah, there are these forces behind it, and often they are also just scared or they don't know. Obviously, something I have also noticed is that some of the large cloud providers from the US seem to be behind that as well, because they will eventually be very happy if the AI comes, because they will become even stronger, while European SMEs will get hurt. Same what happened with the GDPR. So I feel they are also definitely behind those forces.
There's a comment on YouTube earlier by Greg Kay, who says that what we really need, therefore, is education, education, education. It's not so much we need more regulations, There may be some need for some regulations, but until politicians, until trade unionists understand what AI really can do and understand the opportunities, as well as what are the real threats, we're unlikely to make much progress. I guess you're an educator, so you probably agree with that point of view.
Yes, absolutely. We need more education and less fears. Just a few days ago, I talked to one of the top generals of the German military, and he told me whenever he deals with the members of the German parliament, one of the first things they come up with is like Terminator and all of these horror scenarios, but they're just not aware of how we're actually benefiting from AI and that we deal hundreds of times a day with AI already, often without explicitly knowing it. And yes, we need to educate politicians more, like what is actually an algorithm? How do you write a piece of code? Maybe fundamentals of statistics can be very helpful, and showing them concretely how to use AI or where AI is already being used and how it makes us more competitive and how people actually benefit from this, so that it's not just for large corporations that they are sort of taking advantage of it and squeezing out everyone, but also how normal people like you and me benefit from AI, and that we can have a longer, richer, healthier, and happier life.
To continue with the analogy with GM, PNJ in the chat says, well, actually, the people who were opposed to the GM, they had some legitimate concerns, not so much about the science, but about the draconian licensing that sometimes seemed to accompany it, that people who signed up to use GM seeds were locked into very unfavorable terms. In other words, that some of the GM industry was its own worst enemy in terms here. Is there anything analogous? Is the AI industry to an extent misbehaving and causing this adverse reaction by unions and politicians and others?
I'm not aware of anything like this. Maybe there is, but I just don't know.
So it's more as a result of fear and general hangover from Hollywood without a realistic understanding of actual scenarios. Let me take a question that's at the top of the list now, again by Paul Imrie, who says, it's all very well talking about horizontal versus vertical. We should look at legislation for vertical industries, but aren't there some things that are common? And he suggests ethics. Isn't that horizontal? So shouldn't there be a general AI ethics agreed and codified as a starting point for all these industries?
Well, the whole ethic thing is something that is very obscure to me, because we actually don't really know what's ethical and what's not ethical. For example, if you look at autonomous driving and say you're in this very unfortunate situation that the autonomous car needs to pick who should die, who should the car pick? Is a young person more destined to survive, or should we rather save old people? In Europe, we would probably rather sort of want the younger people to survive, but if you look at Southeast Asia, there's a particular respect towards the elderly who may get preference. So I don't think there's that one ethical framework that you can apply worldwide. And I also see lawmakers seriously suggesting that if you're sitting in an autonomous car and there was this kind of very difficult situation to make, the car should be required to bump into a wall or something in order to save pedestrians, and should rather hurt the driver of the car. If that was really like enforced by law, I don't think Mercedes-Benz would ever sell any car again, because people buy Mercedes-Benz because they're the best cars, the safest cars, and people buy this all over the world. And if you require now Mercedes-Benz to rather hurt the driver than a pedestrian, I don't think they will ever sell any car to anyone again. So the whole ethic thing is very obscure. And I think maybe that should also be more regulated in a vertical manner, where it needs to be regulated domain specifically than horizontally, because that one ethical framework, I don't think it exists.
Well, let's try a bit further along this lines. PNJ says, well, actually, there are some horizontal principles. And if you look at engineering, there are general principles of how to do software engineering, which aren't just for one domain, they are broadly applicable. So for example, proper source code configuration and testing items at the unit level and then building up continuous integration. There might be a general principle such as things shouldn't be released without proper peer reviews. Do you not see any agreement on principles that could be encoded in some of that regulations?
Well, those are usually like best practices or results of standardization processes. And something like this indeed could be very helpful in order to increase quality of AI software. But the AI Act is not at all about that, because the AI Act is mainly like something coming up with bans or restrictions, but doesn't really provide any recommendations or best practices. And yes, we do need these best practices and recommendations, and certainly that could be very helpful and could be applied to a number of domains. But the AI Act is not at all about that.
Right. So these things should be generally promoted, but they shouldn't be written into law as such.
Yes, it should be recommendations. It shouldn't be laws. Like, it's the same with programming languages like C++. There are standardization committees that come up with all sorts of guidelines that compiler vendors would eventually implement, but it's not required by law. And I think that's the right approach.
Let's take a specific example. This is one raised by Chris Langdon, who asks about ChatGPT and generative AI. It's very much in people's minds today. And there are a lot of concerns being raised. Plagiarism, for example, the impact on creative jobs. Is this something society should be worried about, or should we just leave it to the free market to work it all out?
Well, ChatGPT is a very exciting software, but it's not new at all. If you just look back 3 years ago, GPT-3 was released, and already newspapers, agencies used it to build or to write newspaper articles. And now ChatGPT is sort of a further improved model of that sort. And yes, there are legal questions, especially around copyrights. And if you just look back maybe half a year ago or a year ago, there was an AI that you could integrate in your IDE in order to write code for you. It was from Microsoft together with GitHub. I forgot the name of that AI. And it turned out that that also caused all sorts of legal problems, because what they did is they took all code that was publicly available on GitHub and fed it into the AI, but they didn't look at all at the open source license. And just because a piece of code is publicly available, it doesn't mean you can simply reuse it for whatever you want. It depends on the license, and there are licenses that give you a lot of freedom, others are very restrictive. And Microsoft and GitHub had completely ignored that. And eventually, I think there are a couple of lawsuits pending concerning that. And the same is the case with ChatGPT or DALL-E. DALL-E is the one that generates like fancy pictures. What was it trained on? On maybe every photo that you can find on the internet? Well, there are also licenses, you know, and copyrights. And yeah, plagiarism is an issue. And I recently saw an article in which researchers used ChatGPT to write a thesis at university. And it's not like that ChatGPT came up with unique sentences. It also heavily plagiarized entire sentences. And that's certainly a problem. But that kind of stuff is forbidden already for humans to do. And probably if you just use text like that, that is generated by an AI, it's not like that this is a completely unregulated domain from my point of view, because it's forbidden already. When it comes to patenting and AI or patents for AI, there has been a lot of developments. If you look at the European Patent Organization, there have been quite a few cases now in the last few years that made all of this area much more clear than before. If you look at the US, it's a very different patent law. But their things are also evolving because of rulings, not necessarily always because of lawmakers, but because of rulings. And that's especially what I noticed here in Europe with the European Patent Organization.
So what kind of things that AI companies are doing today might stop or not be allowed under this act? Terry Raby asks, for example, about what DeepMind is doing with its protein folding software, which is based on huge amounts of data that is harvested. Would that be illegal? Would other systems that are accepted today be diminished or blocked by this law?
Well, the protein folding as such would not be forbidden, but it could be high risk because if some strange stuff comes out of it, it could hurt you, you know. But I don't know. Something much more simple that actually wouldn't be allowed anymore is face recognition. So we all use face recognition. A lot of people use this to unlock their iPhone. And the EU really wants to forbid face recognition in the AI Act, because they are sort of thinking about China and, you know, an out of control executive branch that uses mass surveillance. So they want to ban face recognition entirely, but eventually you wouldn't be allowed to unlock your phone anymore using face recognition. And I don't see how you, and as an individual, get hurt from that. And it's your choice to use face recognition for unlocking. Then the whole topic of social scoring would be forbidden. So if you think about social scoring, you may think about China, where the government uses that extensively to sort of regulate your daily life. And if you don't visit your parents from time to time, you're not allowed to get on a plane or train anymore. That's certainly something we don't want here in Europe, and that's clear. But social scoring is not always just done by government. Say, if you call a call center and you initially talk to the AI about your matter, and then you need to wait in a queue in order to talk to a specialist, they do social scoring, maybe depending on how important you are when you talk to the AI, and then you may be given priority in the support queue. And that is social scoring too, and that would be forbidden as well. And I talked to that about also when I was just last September in the Digital Affairs Committee of the German Parliament. And I said, yeah, social scoring is not always just done by government. It's also done by industry or by individuals, and we benefit from it. And obviously there's also negative social scoring, but if you try to ban social scoring in its entirety, that's definitely not helpful.
Now, these examples are both good and important, I think, facial recognition and social scoring, because yes, there can be misuse, but also there can be positive use. Earlier this week, I watched the session of the UK Parliament's Science and Technology Committee, which were considering the governance of AI, and the MPs asked some of the invited experts what their views were on facial recognition. And one of them said, oh, no, we don't want to use that, you know. And actually the MPs were a bit surprised. They said, well, surely there are cases when facial recognition will be helpful. For example, if a child gets separated from parents in a large crowd, a system might be able to say, this is where the child might be. And of course, humans will still verify it. Is this your child or not? They won't grab the child who has initially been identified and take them home regardless. And so likewise, in looking for potential criminals, there should not be somebody put in prison simply because of facial recognition, but that might be something that would lead to a subsequent investigation. And I thought the experts in that case were a bit shaky, frankly, and I thought the politicians in this case were a bit more on the ball. So what have people said when you've given these examples back and said, do you realize the EU Act's not going to allow people to unlock their phones with faces anymore? Have they said, yes, we accept this is a restriction that's necessary? Or have they said, oh, you're right, this is more complicated?
Well, the more conservative ones definitely agreed with me. The ones from the opposite end of the spectrum just didn't respond at all. But what you mentioned about criminals who may be detected because of face recognition, yes, that's something we definitely need. But yeah, the AI will not make the final decision whether you get locked up or not. And this recently happened in the US just a few weeks ago. It was on the news that one guy was detected by a face recognition system because he looked like someone who was at large. And but a lot of other properties didn't match at all. Like that guy was much slimmer, much younger, and they just locked him up because the AI sort of detected him. And the police officers didn't do any check of the data, like age, weight, whatever. And they just locked him up for 1 week until they noticed he was actually not that person. And I think, and then the AI got blamed for that. No, the AI makes a recommendation and it allows us to heavily automate that process. But yes, there needs to be verification by humans, and humans need to make the final decision. And you cannot ultimately make the decision just because the AI recommended something. And the people who made that mistake, they need to be punished, and not the AI developers or something like this.
Is that perhaps then a general principle, which might even be written into law, that decisions of algorithms must always have human oversight, human verification before anything drastic is done as a result?
Yeah, if it's about health and safety, I mean, not every decision that is made, like a spam filter or whatever, obviously that needs to be fully automated just because it needs to scale. But yeah, where it's about your freedom or your health and safety, same in medicine. We don't want to do a surgery just because an AI recommends that you should undergo surgery because you may have cancer or whatever. But the AI will make a recommendation. And if it can explain its decision, that will be even more helpful. And then your doctor needs to make the final decision ultimately. But now we have this huge shortage of experts, shortage of staff. I guess you have the same issues in the UK like we got here in Central Europe. And there's this enormous number of people that will retire in the coming years in the Western world. AI is definitely a huge opportunity because it not only allows us to do things cheaper and faster and better, but without AI, we may not be able to do that at all anymore. So the AI is something very positive, and it can definitely help us to scale and sort of, deal with less experts then. But those experts need to make the final decision, that's sure.
Let's take a question from Tony Zarneski, who is slightly concerned about some of your suggestions because he says, yes, there are benefits which we should gain, but aren't there also big risks of AI isn't properly in control? Not the risks portrayed in Terminator, not the risks in some of these distorted Hollywood systems, but there are other more credible risks of AI possibly being used in military, possibly being used in management of the infrastructure and so on. And so shouldn't there still be a significant effort to ensure AI does not end up out of control, and that the companies creating AI don't get out of control and just do whatever is best in their shareholder and financial interests?
Well, AI has been used in infrastructure for many decades. If you look at nuclear power plants, a lot of them have been using fuzzy control systems for the last 50 years. And that is also AI. So it's nothing new that AI sort of controls our infrastructure, which is certainly the case for nuclear power plants for many decades. And we need AI and smart grids, whatever. Yeah, ultimately, we as humans need to benefit from that. And we don't want an out of control company that uses AI and then sort of tries to eliminate us. That's sure. But I see AI as something very positive. But again, an AI is usually just a very minor part of a larger system. And large systems in almost all domains we deal with, where there's a risk for health and safety, that is regulated already vertically, but it just doesn't really matter how you build that system. If it's a little bit more or less hardware, more or less software, if there's some AI in it, I don't think this should matter. Finally, the actual system and its impact matter. And that is regulated already in most domains to a very large extent. And where necessary because of AI, yes, we need to add or amend regulation, that's sure. But the AI is usually, again, just a very small part of a very large system.
But aren't there general aspects of, particularly of general AI? This is a question raised by Terry Raby, who says that AI is becoming more generally capable, and therefore it could be applied in multiple different domains, and possibly we need to address the control of that general AI rather than just have to write one legislation over here for this industry, another registration over here for this industry, and so on, because this AI, once it's produced, will suddenly be applicable to multiple industries.
But that's the same with computers, software, and so forth. And you don't really find software regulation, but it's used in many different domains. And because that field also heavily evolves, now you just see what has happened around AI in the last 2 years since the first draft of the AI Act was released. You see there has been a lot of change. So I think we should have more regulation that can actually survive in the next few decades. And that's why we should generally regulate systems where necessary. Product liability is also something that is currently undergoing a big change in Europe. If you look at the product liability directive, that one has not been really updated for the last 30 years. A lot of products nowadays didn't really fall into the product liability directive because all these digital products were not really addressed by the product liability directive. Now there's an update, and I think that's certainly a very positive thing. Now they are also trying to regulate AI liability separately. I don't really get the sense for this. I also said, put it directly into the product regulation, regulate digital products, don't regulate AI on top when it comes to liability. But the fact that the product liability directive is now undergoing an update is something very positive. And then address digital products, and probably then the regulation can last for the next decades.
The software architect part of me, from my background, wants to speak up now. The software architect part of me says that it's bad to architect a platform from scratch. It's much better to take aspects of particular applications and then bring them from the application and make them into a platform later, once they've been proven. You don't develop reusable software before it's usable. In other words, legislation might end up being generally applicable, but it has to start off in a concrete situation. And it sounds like the problem here is that some of those regulations are being designed in a very general way from the word go, without having the benefits of being trialed out in specific areas. So what you're recommending, I think, is let's do relevant amounts of regulation in each vertical industry, and when there are general principles established, then they could be copied into wider regulation, but not from the beginning. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary. And yeah, and if you come up with horizontal things like, for example, recommendations that could be applicable, that's great. But it's awfully difficult to regulate AI. And since AI is a field that is also very quickly moving forward, and if we come up now with an AI specific regulation, maybe in 2 or 3 years, we need to redo it. So that's why I try to regulate it from a more general perspective, and maybe don't focus too much on AI, look at vertical regulations and systems, and then over time, maybe come up with some AI recommendations and best practices. And that's currently what's also happening in industry, that there are more and more best practices around AI.
Do you have any sympathy
Yeah.
for the work of the point of view of the unions who say that in due course they might lose their jobs? I mean, Terry Raby points out that you've assumed that from the time being we are short of labor in many industries. We don't have enough people working in healthcare. We don't have enough people working in many other fields. But over time, AI may become more capable and it may displace more and more workers. Foreseeing that possibility, do you have any sympathy for what the labor unions are talking about?
Obviously, that's a risk, but that's something we've been facing ever since the beginning of the industrial automation, the industrial revolution. For the last 250 years or so, the jobs market has been undergoing enormous changes. And if you just look back 100 years, most of the jobs from that time don't exist anymore. So that change is coming anyway. And the best thing is you can engage, you contribute to the change, rather than the change will eventually replace you. And yeah, we're short of labor. So first of all, we need further automation. That is very critical. And the best thing that you can do is, engage. Also contribute to AI in your domain. So you're at the forefront of the change and you can remain competitive. That's definitely my recommendation. And new jobs will appear, some jobs will disappear. That has happened for the last 250 years, and it keeps happening. Maybe at a more rapid scale, yes, that's certainly a problem. You may have to undergo retraining all the time. But if we don't do this in Europe, others will do it around the world, and eventually we'll be completely out of business. So the best thing is that we actually engage and contribute.
We come back to this education point earlier. This time it's not so much we need to ensure people have an up-to-date and well-informed understanding of AI, is that we need to be able to help people migrate their jobs. Maybe not moving from one occupation to another, but being able to adapt what they do inside their occupation to make better use of the new technologies. Maybe that then would be a better focus for governments and legislators, to assist people to adapt to the new technologies instead of trying to restrict it by inappropriate laws.
Absolutely.
So what are the scenarios you think that may happen in the next 2 to 3 years? And you've been talking to people for a long time about this. What do you think the situation is if we were speaking in 3 years' time? Are we going to be saying, gosh, things have got worse? Or do you think, thank goodness, some politicians in, I don't know, Estonia or Finland, they started to campaign differently and they got a much more sensible system?
Yeah. Well, the AI Act will probably get ratified in a couple of months. So the agenda is that they want to look at thousands of amendments that got tabled in the European Parliament, and they want to look at that sometime in March. Then obviously they need to reach a consensus together with the Council of the European Union, so the governments of the member states. I think it would be very difficult to reach a consensus, but bear in mind that next year in spring, there'll be an election for the European Parliament. And as you know, half a year before the election, members of parliament just stop working and they keep campaigning and campaigning. So either way, they probably have to reach some consensus this year. I guess it will be in a combination with other acts that they maybe do a big block voting and sort of find a consensus for everything, but probably not a good consensus, just something that allows the politician to finish working so they can actually campaign and get re-elected next year.
And are there parts of Europe that, as I was suggesting, might be more clued up about what would be a better set of policies? Or is the understanding uniformly unenlightened, shall we say?
Well, if you look at, for example, Eastern Europe, there, I think the governments are much more open to AI and innovation, yet they play a minor role in the decision-making because most of the decisions are made by some of the big member states effectively. Here in Germany, the government is also not sure about its position. They agreed to something in December in the council, but eventually now it turned out that the three parties that we have in our coalition still completely disagree, and they feel they have not reached a consensus yet. And it's probably the same also in other national governments and within the governments and among them as well.
So my hope would be that they would pare it back to something which is clearer, and instead of trying to get 160 pages, well, I can't remember how many you said, pages of legislation passed, they would focus on doing it in a step-by-step way, which is what good software engineers do anyway. They don't try and build a huge system from the go. They say, well, here's a part we do understand, and here's a part where there is agreement on. Let's put this in law first. Is that credible, or is it going to be all pushed through as some big mashed up agreement?
I unfortunately think it will be pushed through, even though it's the wrong thing, but simply they are running out of time because of the coming election.
So elections are the problem. I guess they're the beauty of the system as well. We can get rid of the politicians that are doing the worst job, at least in principle, but it does detract from focus. Is it the politicians who should be doing this? Is maybe the civil servants and their advisors? They should be having the discussions and then making the recommendations to the politicians?
Well, the civil servants wrote the initial draft, and now it's in parliament, but it's also being discussed in the council. That's the way it goes, and the civil servants obviously probably provide more support as needed, but there is more regulation on the way. So it's not just the AI Act, it's the Data Act, which is another beauty. And something I noticed, the Data Act, AI Act, GDPR, Market Act, Service Act, whatever they are called. So it's at least 5 or 6 big pieces of regulation that were all written by sort of different groups, because all of them wanted to contribute and they sort of feel there's something they should be regulating. The problem is all of those acts finally are not harmonized and they are contradictory. Like the GDPR requires you to protect your data. Then if you build a high-risk system, the AI Act would require you to use a complete data set, which is clearly a violation in regards to the GDPR. And then there's the Data Act that would also even force you to make your data available. Most of that stuff just doesn't fit together at all. And I think that's also a big, big problem, that over the years, all of this digital regulation has come up and none of that is harmonized.
Right. So could industries, the SMEs, for example, could they draft an alternative, shorter, more digestible proposal? This is a suggestion made by Ian Beveridge. I think the SMEs, there were some who did make some feedback on the proposal, but it mainly was, we dislike this part, can you change this? But maybe starting from scratch with a different proposal. Is that feasible?
That would be great. I have not seen anything like this. There are all sorts of lobby organizations in Brussels in which obviously some of these SMEs are part of, but it's just too much regulation that is pending. And even a lot of these lobby organizations are unable to fully understand what the AI Act is about. But I wish to see something like this. And it also turns out a lot of companies, even large ones, they are not really able or willing to speak out publicly. So I talked to some of the CEOs of some of the largest companies in Germany, and they are also absolutely agreeing with me that the AI Act is nonsense. So I asked them, hey, how about we do, like a press release or an interview with a newspaper or a TV channel and just explain how much nonsense all of that is and what the consequences would be. But somehow they don't want to do that. Somehow they are scared of publicly speaking out against the EU. I don't know why, but they totally agree that the AI Act is nonsense, but they just don't want to speak out publicly. And I haven't understood why.
I guess it's similar with GM, to come back to that topic. Many politicians, I believe, will privately concede that the regulation at the EU level on GMs is not good science and maybe even well, bad for humanitarian reasons, but they feel they can't change it, and they feel that if they speak out against it, they will lose more support than they could possibly gain. So they take the decision to keep quiet about it. So what could change this atmosphere? What could cause more people to be more confident in saying, hey, there's a better future for AI. Here's what we could be doing. Let's ensure that we grab this future rather than just being dominated by the precautionary principle.
Yeah, I think one thing that could be very helpful is our hearings in parliaments, also in the European Parliament. But again, here often they largely invite, or the individual groups in a parliament largely invite experts that will just keep telling what the members of parliament want to hear. So I was an expert witness in the German parliament once in the French National Assembly, and once in the Parliament of Luxembourg. There was also a hearing in the European Parliament, but my network told me they specifically did not want to invite me because I was too critical. So I think that is something that is very sad, because in such a process, obviously the members of parliaments are not experts in AI, and no one expects them to be, but they should be inviting independent experts who actually disagree. So we can finally reach a consensus and get the optimal solution. But if you beforehand don't invite specific experts because they are too critical, then obviously will not reach a consensus. And I think we should make the public more aware of the AI Act and what consequences would be, so that we may lose prosperity, that we would lose or would be less competitive. Things like that should be discussed at a more public level. But when I also talk to newspapers and TV channels, they often don't want to cover this stuff because they really struggle to sort of explain this to the average reader, for example. And with all of this AI stuff, they sort of struggle to turn this into a meaningful picture so the general audience understands it. And now with ChatGPT, they are finally able to actually show the public what AI is, because you can visualize all of this very well. But yeah, a lot of these discussions around of the AI Act, they are just too specific. And a lot of newspapers told me that their audience would just not understand it. So they rather cover, I don't know, the next, I don't know, movie or TV series or whatever.
Reality TV star and
Yeah.
sports and whatever. But as you've said, ChatGPT is changing things, because although in some ways it's not much different from previous generative text models, it is easier to use. It's got an improved AI, improved UI, possibly an improved AI as well, due to the RLHF, the reinforcement learning by human feedback that went into it. But the main thing is that more ordinary people, so-called, can log in to ChatGPT and be astonished often at the quality of the answers. So is this not triggering a new concern? And so enlightened newspaper editors should say, hang on, there is an interest here. Let's have somebody explain to us what are the real benefits and what risks may arise from this and what happens next. So are more people knocking on your door in the last few months because of this?
Well, in the last few days, in fact, so I had an interview with RTL Luxembourg. I was also covered in an article of our national TV, and I had an interview with Spiegel, which is one of the major news outlets here in Germany, and that interview will appear. So obviously, this has led to a lot of attention in the last few weeks. And something I keep saying also about ChatGPT, DALL-E, and all of those AIs that generate content now, it's not really that AI will make you unemployed. So if you work for a newspaper or in a marketing agency, the AI alone will not make you unemployed. Who's going to put you out of business are your competitors who use these tools, because your competitor will eventually be 10 times or 100 times more productive, and then you're out of business if you don't use AI. And it's the same with coders. ChatGPT can also write software code, and that's great, but ChatGPT alone will not make you unemployed, because someone still needs to go through that code and amend it and fix it and fine-tune it. But other coders who use this stuff, they will put you out of business because it can increase your productivity by 100 times. And then obviously it will be very difficult for you to keep your salary and your job if your colleague who sits next door is 100 times more efficient.
And that shouldn't necessarily be frightening, because if companies are able to produce new code more quickly, we could have better solutions to all the kinds of things that AI might be involved with. Better medical treatments because new drugs are discovered more quickly. Better agriculture because people find better ways to grow meat in laboratories, or all kinds of other things. So it shouldn't be frightening. But does that same principle apply at the country level too? You say that individuals who don't learn about AI technologies are likely to be rendered displaced in the job market by people who have mastered them. Will countries that are slow to take advantage of AI, perhaps because of inappropriate regulations, will we be surpassed in the world as a whole by other countries who are engaging more fully with the possibilities of AI?
Absolutely. So I keep saying AI is actually the next phase of the industrial revolution, because it's about automating human decision making. And if you automate decision making and you're the world leader in that, you will eventually be able to dominate nearly every industry, because if you can automate decision making and you can do it much faster, cheaper, and better than others, you can become the world leader in nearly everything. So yes, that definitely applies at a global scale, and will also heavily probably change how wealth is distributed around the world.
Indeed. So there is a scenario in the future in which the EU commits to this act, well-intentioned because it doesn't want to see bad things happening to its citizens, but it sinks further down the GDP rankings and other measures of flourishing as a result.
Yeah, and I keep
Anticipating
saying,
that, aren't the people who are saying, hang on, we shouldn't have this law, or we should modify it?
yeah, I fully agree. I think in Europe, we need more innovators and less regulators, because we definitely have this avalanche of regulation, and definitely this will make us less competitive in the coming decades.
Now, I would say it differently myself. I don't think we need less regulators particularly. I think we just need better regulators. We need regulators who have a better understanding of the issues, regulators who are more adaptable, more flexible, regulators who are able to target their processes more precisely rather than having blanket or hammer-like attacks.
And as well, we need more innovators. And something I found astonishing, so you mentioned we need to educate decision makers more in that field. Something I read a few weeks ago was about a US congressman, I forgot his name, but he now goes part-time to university to learn coding and AI, because he kept saying that he just, doesn't understand what all of that regulation is about and what AI and coding is. So he now goes part-time to university, and his hope is to take advantage of these skills to actually be able, as a lawmaker, to actually contribute and create a better innovation ecosystem and help the country as a whole. So I forgot his name, but I'm sure you'll find him on Google.
Well, I hope more people learn the reality of what the systems can do now and what they can do in the future. That education is something we can all benefit from. Now, Patrick, I've sort of stereotyped you so far as being somebody who thinks a lot about AI and regulations, but I know there are many other aspects to your research. You work a lot with healthcare systems, you look at other aspects of computing. What else do you think the politicians don't understand sufficiently, or even the general public don't understand sufficiently about the areas where you're working?
Well, oftentimes it's just simple statistics that a lot of people don't understand. Probabilities, conditional probabilities, and I think just understanding that would already make you much more effective, and you would much better be able to understand what's actually happening around yourself. So probabilities, conditional probabilities, I know these concepts are not easy to get for everyone, but certainly a lot of our environment and the things around us can be described in that way. So understanding probabilities and conditional probabilities is very helpful. And then I think a lot of other problems would eventually disappear. I wish everyone in school learned coding. That's something that is not the case in Germany, unfortunately. The government is unable or unwilling to train teachers in that domain and hire them afterwards. And I think coding is so important. You don't just need it for AI, you would need it for everything. So you can automate this processes around you. And it also, I think, is sort of a mental exercise that you learn to formalize some of your thinking and turn it into an algorithm. So I wish everyone learned this. I don't know if every kid in the UK learns coding, but here in Germany, it's definitely not the case. And that's a very sad thing.
One counter argument I've heard is that we shouldn't bother teaching children how to code because by the time they've grown up, AIs will be coding much better than humans will. So it's a waste of effort. And the counter to that argument is, as you've said, it helps people to think rationally and objectively. It's a bit like in the old days at school, people would learn Latin and Greek, not because they'd speak in ancient Latin or ancient Greek, but it helped to straighten their minds.
Well, and you still need to learn calculating in school, even though you've got a calculator, which will help you to automate them, but you still need to understand the underlying process. And that's very important. And same with coding. You still need coders in the future. Maybe in 10 or 20 years, we will use less Python and we will use some more abstract language, but that's fine because then we can solve even bigger problems. Had we stayed on an assembly level like 50 or 60 years ago, obviously we wouldn't have these very large software systems now because you need abstraction to build them. And yeah, things like ChatGPT or other AI coding tools, they're just the next level of for the automation and an abstraction, but you still need to understand the levels below. So learning coding is definitely extremely helpful.
But are there other developments in computing that you're aware of that might change the landscape of what's possible?
I'm very interested in quantum computing as well. So quantum computers have now become very popular in the last few days. If you look at the new Times magazine, it was about quantum computing. So quantum computers are really cool, and there has been quite some progress in the last few years. Nonetheless, there's also a lot of hype, like you read all sorts of nonsense on the internet and in news article that quantum computers were about to replace all traditional computers and we should only do quantum now. It isn't that. So quantum computers are really cool, but they're still extremely expensive and they don't have a lot of qubits. So what is a qubit? It's a quantum bit. So in a traditional computer, you have a bit which is either 0 or 1, so an exclusive OR, while a qubit can be in both states at the same time with a certain amplitude or certain proportion. And then say if you have 10 qubits, you can be in 2 to the 10 many states, so 1024 states at the same time. So quantum computers are highly parallel, and in certain optimization problems, you could not just look at one possible solution at a time, but maybe at all possible solutions at the same time. So you could get an enormous speed up. Yet we need larger quantum computers with more qubits that are more reliable, and probably they need to become much cheaper. And we're at a very low level when we build quantum algorithms, because we need to think about these qubits and do quantum mechanical operations. And we need to reach higher levels of abstraction so the thing will scale, because again, if you look back at assembly, if we were still using assembly all the time, we wouldn't have built these big computer systems we got now. So we need abstraction. And it isn't straightforward to move a traditional algorithm to a quantum computer, because you need to take advantage of the quantum effects to actually have a speed up. But I think in the foreseeable future, quantum computers will be sort of a niche topic for very specialized tasks. But in those tasks, we can get an exponential speed up sometimes. And once we have larger computers, this would also mean the end of today's encryption, because today's encryption algorithms use keys that are the product of two prime numbers, and prime number factorization requires an exponential amount of time. So that's why we have very large keys, and they are probably uncrackable by today's computers. But with a quantum computer, we could do this exponentially faster, and this would mean the end of today's encryption. We don't know when that day is coming, but at some point it may be here, and that's why a lot of big companies are already working on post-quantum encryption. So once that moment comes, we are prepared, and we have new encryption algorithms that cannot be cracked by a quantum computer.
Well, we could talk about this a long time too. I think it's like AI. It's an area that is poorly understood by the general public and deserves to be better understood because the consequences are profound. Incidentally, if you're listening to this and you'd like to find out more about quantum computing, one place you might look is the London Futurists podcast, because 3 episodes ago, we had an interview with somebody from the Max Planck Institute in Germany, Ignacio Sirac, who gave a whole talk about quantum computing. And then 2 episodes ago, we had Alessandro Curioni, who is leading senior executive at IBM in Zurich, and he also had some thoughts about quantum computing. And I recommend both these episodes to you if you want to take this particular discussion further. I'll come back to you in a minute, Patrick, to give you a chance at any closing remarks. I'll just mention one other thing that London Futurists is doing soon, which is in 1 week's time, we will have a talk on why does misinformation spread? Why do people continue to believe things that are actually counterproductive, dangerous, unhelpful, and still these conspiracy theories and other things persist? How can we have a more rational discussion generally? And the speaker in this case is a professor in the philosophy of science, Cailin O'Connor, who will talk about her research, which suggests that it's not just a matter of logic, it's not just a matter of psychology, there are social factors at play. And if we really want to have better conversations about some of these contentious topics, such as views on AI, potentially in the future, views on quantum computing, we need to address social structures as well as these other factors. So look out for that in 1 week's time. Look out more generally for future events from London Futurists in the usual places. Patrick, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. What final remarks would you wish our audience members to have on the top of their minds?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show today, and thanks for plenty of fantastic questions. I published a book chapter a few months ago on what seemed to me the key issues of the AI Act. You can find this on my website on clowner.info, but I'm also sharing the URL here in the chat. Aside, so you have probably noticed I'm not really happy with the AI Act. I think it has a good intention, but finally it will just not work out. Aside from that, AI is really cool. If you haven't looked into AI yet, you should definitely do that. It will help you to remain competitive. And again, you will probably not be replaced by an AI, but your competitor who uses AI will put you out of business. And that's why also start looking into an AI, make sure you remain competitive. And like this, we can have a richer, happier, and healthier life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will start to transition into a more relaxed mode. Some of the audience probably will leave. In fact, I expect most of the audience will leave, but a small number will be welcome to stay around. And in about 7 to 10 minutes, those who are still here can have a short debrief. I think Patrick may be able to stay when you'll be able to express your views as to things maybe the conversation should also have included. And you'll be able to tell people what you particularly liked about this episode. So thanks again, Patrick, and that's goodbye from me now.
Bye.